We are really thrilled to have Mark Buchanan with us today. Mark and I have known each other for several years, but many of you have known Mark as well. He's been here in the Maritimes a few different times, leading in different ways. Mark is a father and husband, first and foremost, with his family. I've seen him in that role as well as husband and father there, and it's been great to kind of see that as well as a pastor. And now, of course, he's a professor at Ambrose University. And probably most of us know him also as an author. A couple of books that he's written just recently that are very engaging. I've written parts of them, not all of them yet, but really thrilled to have Mark here. He has acted as a mentor in my own life, and so look forward to hearing from him today. Mark, take it away.
Several months ago, Colin contacted me about doing this masterclass on mentoring, and right away, I responded with a robust yes, because this is a topic that matters profoundly to me. It's mattered in my own formation deeply. Some mentors who have poured into my life, some that whose names you would recognize, and others who are only known to a few and to deeply to God. But all of them have had extraordinary outsized influence in my own life. And then by the grace of God, I have for most of my Christian life had the opportunity to pay it forward and pour into others' lives. And currently I have about a dozen people I'm mentoring in different ways. There's a group that I mentor as a group, and then many one-on-ones. And I find tremendous life in it. Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:15 to a church that we know has had some difficulties with, but he says this to the Corinthians. This is again 1 Corinthians 4:15. Even if you had 10,000 guardians in Christ, you do not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I became your father through the gospel. And a guardian is somebody, in a sense, who wants to boss you. They want to tell you what to do. They want to have some sort of proprietorship over you. And it can become oppressive or manipulative or bullying to have a guardian. They're watching out for you, but not necessarily wishing the best for you. Whereas a father, in the heart of a good father, is a desire to see the one whom he comes near to flourish. And that really is, to me, the essence of good mentoring, that we have a father or mother heart toward the one we're mentoring, and we deeply long for their flourishing. We don't want to coerce them into things that are not the will of God for them, but we deeply desire their flourishing. All the same, the next thing that Paul says right after he says, I became a father, he boldly says, therefore I urge you to imitate me. And this is, of course, as you would know, a bit of a motif with Paul, that he often draws attention to himself as an exemplar or a worthy of imitation. I don't think Paul means that they're to comb their hair the way he did. In fact, the rumor was he was bald. That, to dress as he did, to walk as he did in terms of his physical gait or anything. He's talking about some deeper qualities of his own formation in Christ, that they help somebody who's behind him a little bit to sort of understand what it is to have a life in Christ. So that's the heart of mentoring, this parental love for this one you're mentoring, and trying to discern deeply who they are and call it forth and bless it, and where needed, correct it, but always with a mind to flourishing. It's not a guardianship. It's a fathering or a mothering. Two crucial questions when I sit down with somebody who's asked me to mentor them. And one of the things I've never done is approach somebody and said, I think you need me to mentor you. We can talk about that later, maybe in the Q&A, but I have always sort of maybe made an indication that I would be open and willing to have somebody to sort of pour into somebody's life or come alongside them in that way. But I wait for them to initiate. But whenever anybody has, I either explicitly or implicitly probe 2 questions with them to get going. And one is, their question is, what do I want to be? And that would have various timelines. So one would be, if we spend a year together, meeting for an hour or 2 every 3 or 4 weeks, what are you hoping will come out of that? And I'll be more specific about that hoped for outcome when we get to the practical stuff around mentoring. But I want them, without narrowing it down too much, to say, I'm hoping that I become a better whatever, father, husband, preacher, leader. I become a more patient person. So I have a short timeline, the year or so we'll spend together. I usually ask it again, explicitly or implicitly, looking forward into a future that no one can quite see yet. So 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or at retirement. And when I get answers back that say, I really want to write a bunch of books in that time, or I want to travel the world, I certainly applaud that and encourage that. But what I'm fundamentally asking is, what kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be a deeply generous person, a deeply kind person, somebody whose anger is under control and it's not lashing out and causing harm? What are the things you're identifying now that are obstacles to the kind of person you want to be? And how may we walk together and think together around you becoming that person that you actually want to be? Dallas Willard famously said that everybody undergoes a spiritual formation, the saint as well as the terrorist. The sense that things are happening in our lives, influences, things that we're pondering, maybe obsessing over, the kind of news feeds we get, and maybe algorithmically are stacked, so that's the only kind of news feed we get, and then the way we might engage with our worldview and, say, social media, and sort of take on all comers or whatever. There's a sense we're being deeply, deeply, deeply formed in the kind of people we are, sometimes unawares. We're not thinking, oh, what will this look like 5 or 10 or 15 or when I'm retired? But it's very much a question, certainly, that a mentor and a mentee should explore. And then if you could pull up the second question, what do you want your life to say? It's the granite. Yes, there we go. What do you want your life to say? So this is actually projecting all the way to the end. This is a question, if you read this, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey, but this is kind of a meme in thinking about mentoring and formation, is going all the way to that moment when they're speaking at your funeral, or they're etching something that actually reflects your life on the granite that's going to be plunked over top the place where you're buried. And what do you want your life to say? David Brooks, a Jewish commentator in the New York Times, or maybe it's Washington Post, I can't remember. But Brooks says that most of us are trying to kind of project what he calls our curriculum vitae virtues. So the stuff we'd put in a CV if we're applying for a job. I'm smart, I'm efficient, I'm a good team player, I've done all this work, I have all these skills. And he says that we actually, that's fine and well, but we need to be really cultivating our eulogy virtues, the things that could be honestly said about us at our when we're not here anymore, that they wouldn't be a stretch. Nobody would be rolling their eyes in the pews as somebody said, so-and-so is generous, so-and-so is kind. They would be actually nodding, thinking, yes, I remember that time when, unbeknownst to anybody, the profound generosity or kindness of this person. So Brooks, again, the distinction between CV virtues and eulogy virtues. So those are the two questions. Again, sometimes I ask them very explicitly, sometimes I suss them out. But what do I want to be? Not accomplish, but be, and giving various timelines for that. But certainly one of the horizons is the year after, or on the backside of this year of mentoring. I hope for this, and then what do I want my life to say when it's all over? Let's talk about the deep work of mentoring. I have 4 things I want to say, and then 3 things about the practical work. But the deep work to me has become most important, both in terms of my own experience of being mentored and what I try to do when I mentor someone. Some of you will have seen a very silly, foolish, maybe even vulgar spoof on the Arthurian legend by Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But near the end of that, this old gap-toothed man, this brambled-haired old man, meets the surviving knights that are looking for the Grail at some fiery chasm in the highlands of Scotland or something. This fire leaping up from the depths of this thing, rickety wooden rope bridge over this chasm. And he has 3 questions. What is your name? What is your quest? And what is your favorite color? And then there's a variation on that. And it's this goofy little scene, but I think the questions themselves are profound. What is your name? And you know that scripturally, that whole naming of a person is so significant. So we think of Jacob wrestling with God and God asking, what is your name? I'm Jacob. Well, now you're going to be called Israel, not heel grabber, but the one who actually wrestles with God. And we can track that through that there's that name is identity. Name is who you really are. Name is at the deep pulse of our life. What is your name? What is your quest? What is that thing that if you had to say, I feel that God has put me on earth to do something, to accomplish something, to get something done for your kingdom, what is that thing? I love how Peter in Acts 13 speaks of David, and he said, after David had accomplished God's purposes in his generations, he fell asleep or he died then. And I wouldn't mind that on my tombstone. After Buchanan accomplished God's purposes in his generation, only then did he die. But as you well know, and there's lots of writing and teaching on this, we can end up with a submission or a shadow mission, or pursuing that which is not the purpose that God put us on the earth to do. So what is your name? What is your question? What's your favorite color? Again, it's a silly movie, but to me, that's a profound question because it's really asking about personality. I spent a lot of my earlier years wanting to be somebody else, wanting to be somebody who, when I was a little pagan, I wanted to be the lead singer for Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant. When I became a Christ follower, there was various leaders and preachers whom I admired and aspired to be like. But in the end, God doesn't, when we stand in heaven, doesn't ask, were you a more effective, or were you a good knockoff of so-and-so, but were you you? And so what is your favorite color? How have I made you that uniquely you can reflect your identity and your mission through your personality? I teach preaching at Ambrose University and Seminary, where I'm now employed, no longer a pastor, for these last 7-some years. And one of the areas I cover is the preaching portfolio. And I'm often quoting to my students the little dictum of the great Boston preacher, whose name just suddenly fell out of my head. But he said that preaching is truth through personality. Truth through personality. And there's a sense where God is, though there's probably some annoying parts of any of our personalities, or some things that get distorted or exaggerated, God's not changing who you are. So I take that very seriously in terms of some of the deep work that I'm doing is this identity. What is your name? Quest. What is the thing you're put on the earth to do? And who are you? What's your personality? Let me just say a little more about that. I've got the text on the screen here from Luke 3, 31, 22, the baptism of Jesus. When all the people were being baptized, Jesus was baptized too. And as he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased." This is as far as we know, the first time Jesus hears the audible voice. Of course, we have 30 years or so prior to this where we don't know how he heard or engaged with his Father. But this is the first recorded moment where God speaks to his son. And this is prior to Jesus doing anything in terms of his quest and public ministry. He's been building chairs and tables and bookcases or whatever up until this moment as a carpenter, as an apprentice carpenter, as a master carpenter. And yet the Father speaks, first of all, his identity. You are my son, and the relational nature and rootedness of that identity. Whom I love, the profound affection that the Father has for the Son, and with whom I'm well pleased. And the pleasure that God has and the love doesn't not in any way seem conditioned on because you went out and preached an amazing sermon. As far as we know, Jesus hasn't yet preached a sermon. Because you built a enduring, prevailing church. Jesus doesn't do that in his lifetime. He gathers a community. But in other words, the love and the affirmation and the pleasure of the Father, the saying, "You're my son," is in some ways an unconditional thing that simply is flowing out of the heart of God toward Jesus. Now, if you flip over, and I don't have it here on the screen, but if you flip over into Luke 4, we get the desert or the temptation narrative right at the beginning of chapter 4 of Luke. And it's interesting that the devil twice in chapter 4, verse 3, about can you turn these stones into bread, and then the for chapter 9 with the if you bow down to me, I'll give you. No, actually, it's a leap from the temple thing. But in both times, the devil starts the conversation with Jesus this way: "If you are the Son, you need to do something to prove it." Now, just look again at the screen here. God saying, "You are my son." This voice in Jesus' head, and then the Father, the Spirit leading Jesus out in the desert. And as far as we know, the next voice he hears is the voice of the devil asking, "If you are my son," hanging a condition on it. And I cannot overstress how important this is in the work we do as pastors and leaders, but also in the work that we ourselves are working out of this identity piece. That I think most people, especially young leaders, are carrying around the "if I am, then therefore" voice. It's conditioned. It's if I really am loved by God, pleasing to God. If my identity is in God, I have to keep doing things to prove it. And these texts put together say, no. The voice that you need to get loud in your head, because every voice after will test it, is a voice that is simply a declaration of your sonship or daughtership, your belovedness, your pleasingness to God in and of yourself because of who God is and his choosing of you. In fact, I'd go so far, and I'm spending a little more time on this. I do know I've got to get moving on, but this is so foundational to all mentoring work that I've done over the last probably maybe 12 or so years, as I've myself come into kind of a fuller inheritance of this. But if you look at Romans 8:16, where Paul says the Spirit testifies with our spirit that we're children of God. Now think of the shape of Romans 8. Romans 8 begins, "Now there's no condemnation for those in Christ." And it ends with, "Now there is no separation from the love of Christ. And in between Romans 8, we get this story about the groaning creation and the brokenness and all the hardships that we're going to go through. So in other words, all the things that would call into question, am I accepted by God or am I condemned? Am I loved by God or am I cast out? So again, the shape of Romans 8 is no condemnation, no separation. And right in the middle is the Spirit testifies with your spirit that you're a child of God. And I would say that the deep, deep, deep work of the Spirit, before the Spirit is about identifying and stirring up and helping you cultivate gifts, where the Spirit is even developing fruit or Christ-like character, before any of that, the Holy Spirit comes into a person's life to ground them in this identity of a son or daughter of God, that they can walk in an assurance that there's no condemnation, and now and not ever by anything any separation. And if we can get people rooted in that, and this is a discipleship thing too, mentorship and discipleship, then I think all these other things are added unto us. I think helping people kind of have a deep life in the Word, and a life of prayer, and a life of stewarding their gifts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is rooted in, you are my son, you are my daughter, whom I love, with you I'm well pleased. So I spend now a lot of time on that, and that deep work. Secondly, around the deep work is mentoring is so much about getting ourselves out of the way. Many of the people I've ended up mentoring, I would call the most of these or the best of these, in contrast to the least of these. So the least of these is, the person who's bedraggled and maybe didn't get the education and opportunities you did. Socioeconomically might be marginalized in some way. Well, the best of these, or the most of these, are the Davids that come along. And you can see, even when they're 22, they're gonna outstrip you. They're just uber gifted. I've got a young guy in my preaching class now, and he came in and he told me he had never really preached and he was horrible. Oh my goodness, the guy is unbelievably brilliant. I'm coaching him and bringing what I can and trying to get a few bad habits out of the way. But this guy at 23 or something is going to clearly take this thing way further than I ever did. And so one of the things I do a lot of study on the David story, and it's interesting that there's two stories of a mentor doing this well and a mentor doing this poorly. The poorly is obviously the David and Saul story. David comes in, he's uber gifted, a little cocky, a little brash, swaggers about. Youth pastors usually do that. And Saul sort of likes him and uses him, and then hates him and is jealous and tries to throw spears at him. The other story comes earlier in the David narrative. It's before David or Saul are even in the scene. It's a Samuel Eli. And Samuel, a little boy of 7, suddenly is demonstrating this incredible giftedness, and more, this capacity to hear God. And the old man Eli has not heard God maybe forever, but certainly not in a long time. And so this very vulnerable little boy, 7 years old, all alone, the old man could just throttle him, just strangle him right there, and eliminate a rival. And yet, what does Eli do when he realizes that God has bypassed the old man and now going direct to the 7-8-year-old kid? He tutors him in how to hear the voice of God. And so this to me is these stories almost juxtapose, keep telling me, when you get that person whose giftedness is such that it's stirring up potentially some of my own kind of envy, or I wish God had done that with me, or I thought I was going to be that guy and now I'm too old to be that guy. It's very much about getting myself out of the way. And I explicitly, because a lot of people who ask me to mentor them are more gifted than I am, I explicitly kind of go to these stories and say, Buchanan, be an Eli here, not a Saul. So that's a deep work. And a third deep work is the wanting and the giving of the double portion. So this is a story. I'm not gonna even read this bit I've put up, but it's a story of Elisha, and this weird little moment where Elisha knows that Elijah, his mentor, has master is going to be whisked up to heaven on this day. And he goes, he shadows him all day. And it's a bit comical, where Elijah keeps turning around and saying to the kid, "What do you want?" And he goes, "Oh, nothing." And then finally he says, "What do you want?" And Elisha says, "I want a double portion. Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." And what Elijah says is, "This will be a difficult thing. Yet if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise it will not." So a strange little story, but here's what I derive from it. In effect, Elisha is asking to be twice as good as Elijah. He's twice the leader, the double portion. There's no doubt more going on here, and it ties into inheritance things and the firstborn rights and et cetera, et cetera. But there's a sense of, I want to be twice as good as you. And the response, this is a difficult thing. For whom is it difficult? And what I've realized is that people who approach me to mentor often recognize something in me that they want to learn from. But there is often an ambition or an aspiration that they'd be better than me. So coming back to this David Samuel thing, they think they can take it further. And I have to, again, get myself out of the way and not only sort of serve and tutor them in that, but actually get into my heart that I want them to be better than me. I want the double portion for them. Just one last little comment on that. Elijah gives us this condition: if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. And he's whisked up to heaven. It's almost as if he's saying, if you catch me at my moment when I'm closest to God, if you catch me in those moments when I am face to face with God, there's a deep unto deep with God, something will be imparted to you. Again, there's a lot more going in the story than we can unpack, but that's a simple way I understand it. And transfer it when I'm mentoring. I may not use a story, but I may say, there's lots of parts of me that are kind of deplorable and I'm working on, and please don't imitate those bits. We can have a conversation about it. I'll try to be honest about it, but there's stuff in me I would not want to transfer to you. But there's a Godward part of me, a hunger for God in me. And if you catch me at that and you somehow sort of see me in that moment, then something of my, whatever this spirit you see in me that you want more of, that will be transferred to you. One last thing about the deep work, and then I'll get into a few practical things, and then we'll have a Q&A. There's three areas when, the deep work, this last fourth thing. Paul says in 2 Timothy, I remind you to fan into flame. This is Paul talking to Timothy. I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Now, just part of this, he's identified some profound, deep faith that he sees going back in the maternal line in Timothy's mom and his grandmom. Interestingly, he doesn't identify the dad. We know the dad's still alive. That shows up in the book of Acts. So somehow there's again a lack of maybe a wholesome parental influence in Timothy's life, and that may explain partly his timidity. But Paul recognizes this deep wellspring or taproot of faith going back to Lois and Eunice, his mother and grandmother. And he says, I see that in you as also. And then he says, I remind you to fan the flame, the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Now, it's odd that Paul should write this, because Paul is basically the theologian of spiritual gifts, the gifts of God. And up until this moment in Corinthians and Romans and other places where he touches on spiritual gifts, he's very insistent that these are imparted by the Spirit of God, that they're sort of not through human agency. The Spirit of God sees and raises up and imparts some gift to somebody, a gift of speaking or leading or generosity, giving or whatnot. And here he says that gift is in Timothy through the laying on of his hands. So suddenly he's imputed, or he's put into his theology some human agency in the divine action of imparting gifts. So what is that about? The best I can make it of this is that unless an older leader, not necessarily older in age, but just been at this longer, actually touches into flame, touches into being, calls forth the deep thing that's going on that the mentee, the protege may themselves not recognize or have confidence in. And one of the works of a mentee, and again, it's built on all those other things, that you are working out of your identity, helping find them. You are getting yourself out of the way, not throwing spears, but tutoring people in how to hear and know God. You are wanting them to get a double portion of whatever you got. And then when you lay your hands, in a sense, you call forth the deep stuff that they don't even see or believe in yet. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened for me. One of my very first mentors was this old man, Leroy Gager, who was then ancient. He was well into his 80s when I was a 21-year-old new Christian. And he took me under his wings and began to call out of me things that I did not know were there. And I look back, he's long gone to heaven, and wonder if I would be here if not Leroy Gager laying his hands on me in that sense and pulling out of me these deep down things that I didn't have eyes to see or faith to believe in. I'm doing that. I try to do that for a lot of people. This young man I told you about that's uber gifted, 23 or something, and knocking it out of the park with preaching. Really humble, teachable heart. But very much with him, I'm coming alongside and really trying to pour into him and call out these things that he doesn't see and doesn't believe in. I got an email from him this morning after I'd commented on yet another sermon he submitted. And he says, I'm actually thinking now of pursuing pastoral work because of your encouragement of me. And this guy's got pastor written all over him. Like, in fact, when he graduates, if you're looking for somebody who's, the most of these, the best of these, let me know and I'll send you his information. So let's go to the practical work. 3 things what I do. When I sit down with somebody, I'm attentive to all these ways I might kind of cultivate and develop these deeper things. But I'm looking for 3 practical things. I always, after I've had what I call my affinity meeting with somebody. So I explicitly say, if somebody says, will you mentor me? I will first sit down and say, well, let's meet together and just see if we think we've got the capacity and that you think I can give you something, I think I can give you something. So I make no commitment until after that first meeting. But then I say, if I really sense, yeah, this is going to work, and they sense, I ask them to do 3 things. Would you think and ponder and pray about 3 things that you want to cultivate in, say, the year we're together? 1 is going to be some area of character formation that you really, really want to become a more a kinder person, a more generous person, a more joyful person, a less complaining person. And I use various kind of resources for that. Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit contrasted with the works of the flesh, is a great thing. You could just open that and say, is there anything in this list of fruit or in the list of the things of the flesh that you really want to address in the next year? The other resource I have to go to is 2 Peter 1, which has 7 items: add to your faith, knowledge and kindness, etc. So I may take them to that and say, is there stuff here that you really want to work on? But it gives a baseline. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but a baseline to work from a character issue. 2 other things about the character stuff is all of us probably have a thorn in the side. That Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians. A thorn in the side is different from a character flaw. It's something that you're always going to have. You're stuck with it. And it's this sort of weakness that, if I read that text correctly about the thorn in the side, You can play it all day long. You can have intercession. You can have healing prayer, but you're stuck with this thing. And what it does is it keeps you humble and it keeps you dependent on God. But it can mess with your life if you don't walk in this place of dependency. So I may also, especially as the relationship unfolds, begin to probe, is there a thorn in your flesh? Is there a thorn that the devil's trying to take you down with, and you're not probably going to overcome, but you need to actually receive grace and strength from God on a daily basis. And the second thing is I identify, and this is usually a bit later on, what I call the nevertheless. And Solomon, the super wise guy, in I think it's 1 Kings 11, talks about all how smart he is and all the things he can do and all the things he knows and all the things he accomplishes. And then it has this little telling phrase, nevertheless, Solomon was led astray by his many wives. And so as we know, he married and had concubines from all the nations, and he became ensnared by the idolatry of some of those wives and concubines. I try to identify the nevertheless, that thing that's a little door in your life, that a little gap in the door in your life that is never quite sealed tight, never quite locked up, and things can slip in. And so it may be a wound, it may be a sort of a disposition that you picked up and never quite overcame through your life. It may have a sexual dimension, it may have to do with the family of origin, but this nevertheless, it becomes this little gap in the door that things can slip in. A couple more things, and I'm sorry, I was going to get you into chat groups, but I think what we'll do is we'll simply have a time to have a Q&A following this, and we're just about done. So the second thing is the practical work. The second thing in the practical work of mentoring is skill development. Again, Paul says to Timothy, fan into flame the gift that is in you. So how might I help stoke a giftedness? And I will ask, again, when I'm meeting after I've decided I will mentor this person over the next year or so, I will ask, what character or character traits, issues do you want to address? What skill stuff do you want to deal with? I'm currently mentoring a young man who's doing an internship at the church I attend, and he's asked me if I'd mentor him on preaching. So I go over his manuscripts and we go over them together. But he specifically identified, I want to become a better communicator. And one of the things, by the way, of these asking these questions, what character formation or development do you want, what skill development, is then I'm quite clear whether I can bring something or not. So if somebody said to me, I've got a picture of the piano, I want to become a better pianist, I would have to say, I'm not your guy. I don't play the piano. I don't know how to play the piano. So when they start identifying, I want to grow in this, I can very quickly say, can you pick something else? Or, man, your whole list, there's nothing I don't think I can bring to you. So I may not be the person to mentor you in this season. And then lastly, knowledge acquisition. Is there something you want to learn that I could be a catalyst for? You could read your own books, etc., or you could take a course, but this could be a bit of a crash course where I maybe know a lot about something and I could transfer that information fairly quickly or direct you to resources around it. So I can't tell you how many times when I put this in front of people, what knowledge do you want? They'll pick from a theme of a book I've written, and almost always it's the Sabbath book, and they say, I really suck at Sabbath and rest, and I want to acquire as much understanding of that as I possibly can. That actually then shifts into some skill stuff, because there's actually some practices that we need to get good at to do Sabbath well. But mainly it starts with some knowledge acquisition. And again, I could just sort of assign them, here's a bunch of books, but I do know a fair amount of that, not simply because I wrote a book about it a while back, but because I do a fair amount of speaking on the Sabbath theme. But there might be something around theology. There's some understanding of God, the incarnation, the Trinity, something. Sometimes it's around leadership things. A lot of questions I get asked is around navigating these politics that we find in church. One of the things I'm getting a lot of questions on right now is all of the polarized views around COVID and masks, etc. And I've met with a lot of pastors in the last several months who are, ready to run to the hills or buy a gun or just themselves tired of trying to navigate that. And so they're asking, how do you do that well? I have a young, by the way, and you can ask about this, I'm about finished here. I have a young woman actually in Toronto area. She was here taking courses, remarkable, one of my most remarkable students, a young woman from Vietnam. And she is extraordinary communicator, leader, a woman of faith. She's taught me more about what a life of faith looks like than just about anybody I've ever met. But prior to her leaving to Toronto, where she took on the role of a lead pastor in an English congregation in a Vietnamese church, she asked me to mentor her. But now I weigh in through Zoom with her. And a lot of her questions are these knowledge questions. There's very little I can character. She's my mentor in terms of skills. She's equal to anything I can do and then some. But in terms of knowledge, she's particularly, this is her first pastorate. She did some grassroots ministry stuff in Vietnam, but this is her first taking on a key leadership role, and she's got tons of questions about stuff. So that's an area that I've lived in long enough that I think I can pass something on.